Welcome to today's program titled Guidance on State and Local Paid Sick Leave Laws, Part 8, Spotlighting New Mexico and West Hollywood, California. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged in to the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down, as it will not be reread, and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials, along with the CLE attendance form, will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Josh Seidman. Josh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to part 8 of our paid sick leave webinar series. So happy to be here with you today. We have a really great presentation for you. We're going to be emphasizing 2 of the newest paid sick leave and PTO laws that have come out in the country over the last handful of months, both of which go into effect later this week. So lots of important updates for you. Lots of nuances with both of those laws, so we're happy to bring these developments to you during the presentation today. Joining me are 3 of our core leave of absence and accommodations counseling team members, Marlon Duro, Bernie Olshansky, and Renata Walker. I'm Josh Seidman. The 4 of us are all, again, so happy to be here with you today, and we have a jam-packed agenda, so let's jump right in and show you what we have in store for you. On this slide, you'll see our agenda. We're going to get started with a nationwide general paid sick leave overview, talk about what the landscape looks like today as we head into the midpoint of 2022. We'll also then spend some time talking about COVID paid leave and what that landscape looks like. As you'll hear, even though COVID-19 is not as pressing of a matter in terms of paid leave as it was this time in 2021 or this time in 2020, there are still a number of COVID paid leave mandates, COVID paid leave guidance that is out there impacting employers in a number of states and localities. So Renata will bring you that update in just a few minutes. We'll then turn our attention to the first of the 2 laws that are going into effect later this week, and that is the New Mexico Healthy Workplaces Act. Marlon will give us the important overview and updates on that mandate, including recent developments in terms of final regulations, as well as FAQs and other administrative guidance. We'll then turn it over to Bernie to talk about the West Hollywood, California compensated time off mandate. Both New Mexico and West Hollywood's mandates are quite complex, as you will hear from those 2 speakers, so definitely buckle up for those sections. As a sort of surprise add-on for this webinar, earlier this month, Bloomington, Minnesota passed an earned sick and safe leave law, and we've been able to put together some nice materials on this standard and are able to bring a summary of this newest enacted paid sick leave law to you towards the tail end of today's presentation. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up today with a very quick overview of where we think paid sick leave and PTO laws are heading into the second half of 2022 and into 2023. As a reminder, and as I said a minute ago, today is part 8 of our webinar series. We've covered 7 parts, as sort of makes sense, over the last year and a half. Part 1 of our webinar series focused on New York state and local paid sick and safe time laws. Part 2 included an update on New York, but also focuses on Colorado and Maine's specific laws. Parts 3 and 7 were a year apart and focused on COVID-19 paid leave developments. We also had coverages of nationwide compliance options, navigating the patchwork of paid sick leave laws and what some of those options look like for employers with multi-state and nationwide operations. And we also took a deep look at prospects for federal paid leave. All of those recordings are available. The slide decks are available. So if you have any interest in looking back at those presentations, please do reach out to us. We're happy to provide them. All right, next slide, please. Let's jump into our nationwide overview. And one more slide, please. So This slide is always fun for me to talk about during these presentations because it helps take a messy patchwork and a landscape that is quite volatile and in flux and throw it into a single, snapshot of what things look like. We have a total as of this month, just last week when we were putting all this material together for you, 66 total paid sick leave and PTO laws around the country. Now, that number, amazingly enough, if you rewind 7, 8 years, there were single digits for paid sick leave laws around the country. You fast forward to today, and because of the growth in this space, especially the last 2 years with the COVID paid leave laws, we've been ebbing and flowing in the low to mid to high 60s, really since the tail end of 2020. And as you can see on the bottom of that leftmost column, this number of total mandates in the US was in the very high 60s, 69 or so mandates at the end of 2020. But this number is constantly changing, as I said a minute ago. And if you also think about the numbers and how they add up, the amount of mandates in the rightmost columns, the federal, the state, and the municipal columns, don't add up to 66 total mandates. And the answer and the reason for why that is because many jurisdictions have multiple paid sick leave laws. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But to sort of round this out for you, firstly, at the federal level, we still have Executive Order 13706, which provides paid sick leave to certain employees of certain federal contractors and subcontractors. It's been around since the Obama era. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act gets a shout out, sort of an honorable mention, but that has ended as of really the end of 2020. And then also benefits for reimbursement are no longer available as of September of last year. But again, because it was a federal mandate that impacted paid sick leave, albeit for only certain employers, certain reasons related to COVID, it gets a shout out here. At the state level, you can see almost 40% of the states around in our country currently have a statewide paid sick leave mandate. That is a huge number. And again, worth looking at. You can see some are paid sick leave, a few are PTO, specifically in Maine and Nevada. Again, we'll be focusing on New Mexico in just a few minutes. And then at the municipal level, tons of major cities, San Francisco, Seattle, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, among others. A number of counties as well, Allegheny County in Pennsylvania, Montgomery County in Maryland, Bernalillo County in New Mexico, and a few others that have these type of mandates. So again, this is a nice snapshot for you. And there are locations, like I said a minute ago, that have multiple of these type of laws. So just because you see a location listed once here does not mean that it only has one mandate. For example, California has multiple mandates. It has a general paid sick leave law, a supplemental COVID paid sick leave law that is reenacted a few months ago, and even a Cal OSHA payment requirement for certain COVID-related workplace exclusions. So California gets counted 3 times when you're factoring in the number of total mandates, for example. A couple of final points before we move off of this slide. Firstly, there are a number of different types of mandates that make up the total count on this slide, and that is in terms of non-COVID laws. There are paid sick leave laws, paid safe and sick leave laws, paid safe leave only laws, public health emergency mandates, and paid time off personal leave laws. So just give you a sense of what we're looking at and what goes into this head count. And then finally, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, those are highlighted in red because none of those mandates are in effect. They're either temporarily or permanently enjoined as part of litigations, multiple litigations impacting those mandates. So as you'll see on the next slide, this is a resource that we've rolled out back in the beginning of 2021. And we're actually in the process of updating this map. We'll be bringing you the next iteration of this tail end of this year. So stay tuned for this resource. It's one of my favorites that we've rolled out for clients and the public. It's an interactive map that shows you where paid sick leave mandates started and how complicated and messy the patchwork has gotten because of COVID, because of paid time off laws, because of things called anti-paid sick leave laws and the like. There's a link at the bottom of this slide for you if you want to take a look and have a walk down memory lane with respect to paid sick leave in our country. And we'll turn it now over to Renata on the next slide to give you a quick update on the COVID paid leave landscape that is currently in place.
Thank you, Josh. So give a little background on the COVID-19 paid leave space. There have been 5 different types of leave laws that have been impacted by COVID-19 developments. Those include paid sick and safe time laws. There are at least 40 locations with developments there, and we will talk mostly about those today. Paid time off laws, for example, the state of Nevada issued guidance addressing government-mandated quarantines and the impact of those on paid time off. Paid family and medical leave laws, for example, there have been expansions in both New York and New Jersey. State disability insurance laws, as well as unpaid family and medical leave laws. Next slide, please. So today we will focus on paid sick leave and paid time off laws with COVID-19 developments. In this category, there are 4 subgroups, which we have color-coded for you. This will provide a visual representation with the different types of laws, and we will talk about, where we've come from 2020, where we are today, and where we can maybe expect to be moving forward. So group 1 is our orange group. This represents new mandates that require employers to provide paid leave for COVID-19 related reasons other than vaccines. And so this could be things like COVID-19 temporary supplemental paid sick leave mandates, such as what we have in California, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, COVID-19 emergency paid leave mandates with no defined sunset dates that are tied to COVID-19, such as what's going on in New York, general public health emergency leave mandates, such as the one in Colorado, which is still in effect. Then we have group 2, which is our blue group. This represents new mandates that require employers to provide paid leave for COVID-19 vaccine-related reasons. This could include vaccines for both employees and or family members receiving COVID-19 vaccines. Group 3 represents amendments to existing general or non-COVID-19 paid leave laws and regulations addressing COVID-19. Group 4 is our purple group, and this is the general COVID-19 leave law general non-COVID-19 leave law non-binding guidance regarding the applicability of these existing laws in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is also worth noting that there are some locations that have passed anti-retaliation mandates, and those mandates protect employees who are absent from work due to COVID-19 related reasons from employment actions such as discipline or termination. These are different than paid leave mandates, and so we're not specifically going to cover those today. Next slide, please. So looking back at where we were in 2020, at the end of 2020, there were 34 locations that had been impacted in some way by COVID-19 paid sick leave developments. And at that point, none of the developments that had gone into effect had sunset, so everything was still in effect. You may notice on this slide that there is no blue text. As you recall, the blue group was our COVID-19 vaccine paid leave. So there were no COVID-19 vaccine paid leave laws in effect at the end of 2020. Of course, vaccines were not readily available at that time. Moving on to the next slide, we'll kind of fast forward to where we are today, June of 2022. So throughout the pandemic, we've had 41 different locations impacted. Now you can see there is a lot of strike-through text on this slide. That represents the laws that have sunset. And so compared to where we were in 2020, we're looking at a much more tame landscape in the space at this point. We're down to just 27 locations impacted. And even some vaccine laws, as you can see, have come and gone already during this time. But with that being said, there certainly are still many relevant laws impacting each of the topics that we have identified: supplemental paid sick leave developments, guidance impacting general paid sick leave and paid time off laws, expanded paid family and medical leave laws, and vaccine mandates. So a lot of these mandates do still remain in place and continue to be longer term. So we are continuing, of course, to monitor the status of each of these. And on that note, there are a few things that you should kind of have on your radar to be aware of over the next several months. The first upcoming date is in Pittsburgh. Towards the end of July, the COVID-19 paid sick leave mandate is scheduled to sunset in Pittsburgh. Also, the mandate in California, the paid sick leave, COVID-19 paid sick leave mandate, is scheduled to sunset at the end of September. In Washington, D.C., the COVID-19 vaccine paid leave is scheduled to sunset October 1. And then in New York and New York City, the COVID-19 vaccine leave mandates are scheduled to sunset at the end of 2022. So whether these mandates get extended or, sunset remains to be seen at this point. Even if they do sunset, we think that still leaves open the possibility that new mandates could still pop up. And some locations have already seen multiple iterations of very similar mandates. So, for example, in California, we've seen the supplemental paid sick leave mandate in 3 different times, 2020, 2021, and 2022. Similarly, in Philadelphia, we've seen that one 3 times. Pittsburgh has come around twice. So certainly just because a location has a mandate that sunsets does not mean that they're, completely off the radar. So we will continue to pay attention to these types of developments to see if any of these mandates sunset or even perhaps become permanent. And with that, I will transition to Marlon Duro to take us into the non-COVID-19 portion of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Renata. So next slide, please. We're going to be talking about the New Mexico paid sick leave law. Next slide, please. On March 7th, 2021, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham signed into law the New Mexico Healthy Workplaces Act. Since then, there have been a lot of updates about the law. There were FAQs that were released earlier this year. And then last week, the state released final regulations as well as updated FAQs. So there have been lots of updates. And the law goes into effect this Friday, July 1st. And as you will see when we discuss this law is very employee-friendly and has very burdensome requirements on employers, especially as compared to other paid sick leave laws in the Southwest and West Coast region. As the law currently stands, it does not get rid of the Bernalillo County Local Paid Time Off Ordinance. So if you're covered under that ordinance, you must continue to comply with that ordinance in addition to the statewide paid sick leave law. As you see on this slide, in terms of employer coverage, the law is very broad and covers employers employing 1 or more employees at any time. However, there are some exemptions. It does not cover government employers. And also for any of you who might have workplaces on tribal land, employers with workplaces on tribal land are not covered, as the state does not have the ability or the authority to enforce the law in those areas. For employers wondering that whether the law would cover employers who don't have a physical presence in the state but may have employees working there, the FAQs clarify that regardless of whether the business is actually located in New Mexico or out of the state, employees performing work in New Mexico have to be provided with paid sick leave under the law. Employee coverage is also pretty broad. It covers all types of different employees, including part-time, seasonal, and employees working on a temporary basis. However, there are some exemptions here as well. Independent contractors and subcontractors, for example, are not considered covered employees. Also, employees who are subject to the provisions of Title II of the Federal Railway Labor Act, the Federal Railroad Unemployment Insurance Act, or the Federal Employers Liability Act are not covered under this law. For those of you with telecommuting or remote employees in New Mexico, whether they are covered is currently an open question. The FAQs provide that the state will evaluate on a case-by-case basis whether those employees are covered. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the numbers, and as I mentioned earlier, you'll see that this law is more burdensome than other laws in the region. Start of accrual is pretty common, just like most paid sick leave laws. Accrual begins either on the effective date of the law, which is this Friday, and for any employee who's hired after this Friday, they would begin to accrue leave at the start of their employment. The accrual rate is also pretty standard. 1 hour of paid sick leave is accrued for every 30 hours worked. Now, the law has some interesting guidance about the different types of times that employees can accrue paid sick leave for outside of what we typically think of when we think of work time. So one of the things that the FAQs address is whether employees accrue paid sick leave during travel time. And the guidance provides that travel during the day from one job site to the next job site is considered compensable work time, so employees can accrue paid sick leave for that time. If employees are required to meet at a central location before they're transported to a job site, that is also considered compensable time under New Mexico law, because the portal-to-portal exclusion under the FLSA does not apply, and employees actually have to accrue time for that travel time. However, when the employee is simply commuting from home to the workplace or from the work to their home, that time is not compensable time, and therefore employees do not accrue leave for their commute. In terms of the accrual cap, there is no accrual cap expressly listed in the law, and in fact the FAQs confirm that there is no accrual cap, and that they specifically say that it is illegal to cap the number of hours that an employee can accrue. This is very unusual for paid sick leave laws in that region, although New Mexico wouldn't be the first place without an accrual cap, because Washington and the local laws there don't have an accrual cap. It is very different from Arizona that only has a 40-hour accrual cap, or California and Colorado that have a 48-hour accrual cap. So it doesn't follow what the laws in the surrounding states do. The law caps carryover at 64 hours. So employees have to be able to carry over 64 hours of accrued unused leave to the following year. And usage is capped at 64 hours of paid sick leave per year. So it's not quite as bad as the Washington law where there is no usage cap as well. It does have a usage cap, but again, this is significantly greater than states in that area. So California, for example, has a 24-hour usage cap, Arizona and Oregon 40 hours, and Colorado general paid sick leave law at 48 hours. So it is much greater than most laws. Next slide, please. So for those of you wondering if you can do away with accrual, I have some bad news there. So although the paid sick leave law does permit employees to front load sick leave at the start of the year and prorated for employees who are hired later in the year, front loading the time does not get rid of carryover obligations or accrual. Typically, the reason that employers decide to front load is because if you give the time at the start of the year, then you don't have to worry about tracking the time that employees are working, and figuring out what they would have accrued at the rate of 1 hour for every 30 hours worked. And then in many jurisdictions, once you give that time, you don't have to worry about carryover either. Unfortunately here, front loading, like I said, does not get rid of accrual tracking. So even if you front load 64 hours at the start of the year, you still have to track the number of times that the employees worked. And in the FAQs, the state did some math for us already. So they say that if an employee has worked 1,920 hours, they have earned the full 64 hours of paid sick leave that would have been granted to them at the start of the year. So for any time that they work beyond the 1,920 hours, they have to accrue time at the 1 hour for every 30 hours worked rate. And like I said, you still have to permit carryover at the end of the year, so up to 64 hours of accrued unused time have to be carried over regardless of whether you front loaded the time. One other interesting thing to note about this is that New Mexico is considering 2022 a transition year since the law takes effect in the middle of the year rather than on January 1st. So for those of you who already have policies in place and have granted employees time on January 1st, and you've given them at least 64 hours, you might be hoping that that means you don't have to worry about the New Mexico law until next January. Unfortunately, the FAQs provide that employers cannot offset the requirements of the leave under this law with time that the employee has already earned or used since January 1st, 2022. Instead, starting this Friday, July 1st, employers can either award employees a front-load lump sum grant of paid sick leave based on the anticipated hours that they will work for the rest of the year, or you have to let them accrue time. So for those of you who were hoping that your CBAs might cover you and you don't have to worry about the law, unfortunately, more bad news here. CBAs have to comply with the rights of the law. So if you have a CBA that does not provide leave as required by the law, you would have to update that and comply with the law. For those of you who might have unlimited PTO policies or other PTO policies, you still have to make sure that they comply with all the requirements of the law. Specifically, the FAQs say that those policies have to meet the accrual or front-loading, carryover, usage, and terms and conditions of the law, including reasons for use, covered family members, notice, documentation, payment, waiting period, and every other term and condition that the law requires. And as a reminder, even if you're front-loading the time or giving unlimited PTO, you still have to track why employees are using the time. So basically, regardless of the type of CBA, CBA or policy that you might have, you still would have to comply with this law. In terms of payment of sick leave, so sick leave is compensated at the same hourly rate and with the same benefits, including healthcare benefits, as the employee normally earns during the hours worked. And it cannot be less than applicable minimum wage. So nothing unusual there. We see this standard pretty frequently across paid sick leave laws. Nothing unusual either in terms of the time increment limitation, although as you'll see, it's a very employee-friendly increment of use. So sick leave has to be used in the smaller of either an hourly increment or the smallest increment that the employer's payroll system uses to account for absences or use of other times. Although very employee-friendly, we've seen this across many other laws, so nothing too unusual there. Next slide, please. So New Mexico joined a group, a very small but growing group of states that have no usage waiting period. So that means employees can use paid sick leave as that time accrues without having any waiting period. In terms of reasons for use, most of the reasons for use under this law are pretty common, and we see them across paid sick leave laws, but there is one exception to that I'll address. But just like we see across the board, employees can use leave for their own or a covered family member's sick leave needs. That includes absences due to a mental or physical illness, injury, or health condition, due to a medical diagnosis, care, or treatment of a mental or physical illness, injury, or health condition, or preventative medical care. It also provides leave, like many laws do, for safe time absences. In this case, they define it as domestic abuse, sexual assault, or stalking that's suffered by the employee or a covered family member. Where this law differs, and for those of you who have operations in New Jersey, this might sound familiar to you because New Jersey has a similar reason for use, is that employees can use leave for meetings at the child's school or place of care in connection with a child's health or disability. So although not very common across the board, it's not quite unique just to New Mexico. In terms of covered family members, the law is very broad, but again, nothing too unusual there. It covers an employee's spouse or domestic partner, or any person related to an employee or the employee's spouse or domestic partner as any of the following relationships: a child, a parent, a grandparent, a grandchild, a sibling, the spouse or domestic partner of a family member, or the broad catch-all term of an individual whose close association with the employee or the employee's spouse or domestic partner is the equivalent of a family relationship. Next slide, please. So the law does require employees to provide notice to employers as well as documentation under certain circumstances. Nothing too unusual here. Generally, the employee has to provide oral or written requests to the employer, or somebody could do that if they're acting on the employee's behalf. Employees have to make a reasonable effort to provide notice in advance if the leave is foreseeable, and they have to make a reasonable effort to schedule time in a manner that does not unduly disrupt the operations of the employer. Unlike some laws, it doesn't say exactly how far in advance the notice has to be given for foreseeable absences. For unforeseeable absences, it's pretty standard, and the employee has to give oral or written notice as soon as practicable. Employers can require documentation under certain circumstances, and that is if the employee uses leave for 2 or more consecutive work days. Based on the final regulations, employees have 14 days from the day that they return to work to provide the documentation. The type of documentation that they have to provide depends on whether the leave is for sick leave absences or safe leave absences, and the law provides details about what is considered reasonable. Next slide, please. So finally, we're going to talk about some non-policy requirements. So these are obligations that employers have, but these are not things that we put in a written policy. One of those things is notice and posting. The law comes with both a notice and posting obligations. So employers have to give written or electronic notice to an employee at the commencement of employment of the rights under the law. There is a model notice that has been released by the state, and that could be used to satisfy the employer's obligation. Employers also have to post the notice, and it has to be posted in a conspicuous and accessible place in each establishment where employees are employed. The poster and the notice have to be provided in English, in Spanish, and any language that is the first language of spoken by at least 10% of the employer's workforce. For those of you with fully remote businesses, this notice and posting obligation could be met through electronic means. And now, with available balance notification, when the law was passed, there was no such notice, but the final regulations state that employers have to provide employees with an accurate year-to-date written summary of earned sick leave accrued and used at least once in every calendar quarter. This could be done electronically, or employers can also choose to put this information on pay records or earning statements that are received by employees according to their normal pay schedule. So if you do that, you're deemed to be compliant. The record-keeping requirement is pretty standard. You have to keep certain records for a period of 2 years. And then finally, in regards to written policy requirements, there's no specific written policy required by the law, but the May 2022 FAQs that the state released say that the state recommends employers to not only provide a notice of the law, but also any policy changes to all employees affected by the changes. And with that, I will pass it over to Bernie.
Thanks, Marlon. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. I'll be talking about West Hollywood's unique compensated time off mandate. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. It'll be apparent why West Hollywood is unique in the following slides, but I'll start off with some statewide and national context for West Hollywood's compensated time off law. In addition to the California statewide paid sick leave law, there are local non-COVID paid sick leave mandates in the following municipalities: Berkeley, Emeryville, Los Angeles, Oakland, San Diego, San Francisco, and Santa Monica. In addition, both Long Beach and Los Angeles have industry-specific paid sick leave ordinances affecting certain hotel employers. California also has several related statewide laws covering vacation time and KinCare. And a few unique jurisdictions that West Hollywood joins are Maine, Bernalillo County, New Mexico, and Nevada. These have also enacted paid time off laws rather than a law that's limited solely to paid safe and sick leave. And we can move to the next slide. West Hollywood's time off law is an outlier, as I mentioned, when compared to other California laws. All of the other laws are paid sick leave laws. And here, as we'll get to, West Hollywood's law is a compensated time off law. And a percentage of the time required to be provided to employees needs to be vacation or personal time. West Hollywood's the only jurisdiction right now that provides more than just sick leave. All of the other jurisdictions in California mentioned right before this only include point-in-time accrual caps rather than annual accruals. And West Hollywood's 2 accrual caps make this law an anomaly and also require companies to set up their systems differently for West Hollywood than for other California jurisdictions. A note on carryover: accrued unused compensated time off will carry over until the time reaches a maximum balance of 192 hours. That's a pretty high number. It's more than double the next highest, San Diego with 80, and a number of others at 72 hours, and almost quadruple the statewide cap of 48. One note on cash out. If you were familiar with the original ordinance, that ordinance required covered employers to provide a cash payment to employees every 30 days for any accrued time above 192 hours. However, the amended version, which came out last month, and regulations establish the 192-hour maximum balance cap, a point-in-time accrual cap, and then deleted the 30-day cash-out provision. So thus, to be very clear, employers are not required to provide cash payments to employees who reach the maximum accrued compensated time off. And that'll take us into the next slide. There are 2 different effective dates. One for hotel employers, this law took effect January 1st of this year, and for all other employers, it'll take effect on Friday, July 1st. A few notes on eligibility and coverage, and specifically definitions. As you can see, independent contractors are not covered, and the ordinance specifically defines employee, hotel employer, employer, and hotel worker. I won't bore you with the definitions of every single one of those. However, I do want to highlight that for the definition of employee, The ordinance defines employee as any person who in a particular week performs at least 2 hours of work within the geographic boundaries of West Hollywood and is entitled to minimum wage under the California Labor Code and associated wage orders. So in other words, there is a physical presence requirement to be defined as an employee. Also, to note, we received informal confirmation of coverage of only non-exempt employees from the city of West Hollywood. And in addition, employees who do not spend all of their time in the city only accrue time off based on the time worked within the city. As to the definition of non-hotel employers, the law has a broad coverage standard for those non-hotel employers, for which the law goes into effect on Friday. Generally, a company who employs or exercises control over the wages, hours, or working condition of any employee constitutes a non-hotel employer under the law. And we can move on to the next slide, which covers accrual. Accrual begins on the first day of employment or on July 1st, 2022 for existing employees. As an initial point, there's no accrual for work in excess of 40 hours per week. Accrual breaks down by full-time and part-time employees and further by compensated versus uncompensated time off. So we'll start with compensated time off. The accrual rate is a weird 96 over 52 hours of compensated time off each week in a calendar year. To make this slightly easier, that's 0.047 hours of compensated leave per hour for a full-time employee. There is proration for part-time employees and an annual accrual cap for compensated time off of 96 hours. And then, as we mentioned, that point-in-time accrual cap of 192 hours. As to uncompensated time off, that accrues at a rate of 80 over 52 hours per week in a calendar year. And if it's any easier, that simplifies to 0.039 hours of uncompensated leave for each hour worked. There is an annual accrual cap of the uncompensated time off of 80 hours for sick leave, and that is after the exhaustion of compensated time off. And I'll get into that in a following slide. We can go ahead and move on to the next one. This slide covers front loading. Similar to Marlon's bad news, front loading does not eliminate the requirement for year-end carryover, but it is allowed. The ordinance itself is silent, but the FAQs clarify the permissibility of front loading. This law is highly pro-employee, as we mentioned, because of the lack of a usage cap and a high accrual cap. And then a note on carryover, again, accrued unused compensated time off carries over until the maximum balance of 192 hours. And then again, to highlight the point that we made earlier, the amendments did away with the monthly cash out requirement. So employers are not required to provide cash payments to employees who reach the maximum accrued compensated time off. We can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So time can be compartmentalized under the West Hollywood law. Employers can comply with the law if they provide a combined leave of no less than 96 hours for full-time workers. And again, this is prorated for part-time employees. Employers can choose to comply with West Hollywood's law via a single bucket or multiple buckets of compensated time off. So you'll see we break this down into two options. Option one would be a bucket of paid time off only, and I'll get into paid time off in the following slide. But the second option would be a bucket of at least 50% to vacation or personal necessity, and then a separate bucket of 50% to paid sick leave as defined by California law. You'll see West Hollywood cites the California Labor Code, and California paid sick time and vacation time laws must be accounted for. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. So as to the reasons for use, compensated time off is defined under the West Hollywood law as paid sick leave, vacation, or personal necessity. And as noted above, employers can provide either a single bucket or 2 buckets of compensated time off. If using the single bucket, the employers must provide paid time off. And if the employer uses 2 buckets, 50% must be earmarked, again, for vacation or personal necessity, and the other 50% to paid sick leave as defined by California law. So California's paid sick leave reasons for use, as a reminder, are the diagnosis, care, or treatment of an existing health condition of or preventative care for an employee or an employee's family member, and 2, for an employee who is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, and takes time off of work to obtain or attempt to obtain any relief. And then another reminder for uncompensated leave, that uncompensated time off only kicks in when an employee has exhausted their compensated time off. So, for example, for the illness of a family member, which is defined under California's Family Rights Act, SFRA, and the reasons for use under SFRA are the birth of a child, the placement of a child in an employee's family for adoption, and a few other reasons. And with that, we can move on to the next slide. Use requirements. There is a usage waiting period for new hires. Under the West Hollywood law, compensated time off must be used after the first 6 months. But the California paid sick leave law and its usage period for new hires is 90 days. So we recommend going with the California more employee favorable standard for compensated and uncompensated time off. As to the rate of pay, unlike California's statewide paid sick leave law, the West Hollywood law's rate of paid time off is based upon the employee's base rate of pay. So employers who seek to have paid sick leave comply with both state and local requirements will need to ensure that employees are paid at the highest applicable rate. The FAQ has also confirmed that tips are not included in an employee's rate of pay. As to increments of use, there's no provision in the law itself, but we recommend following California's state law standard. As to employee notice, the rules require employees to provide, quote, reasonable notice, and there's no provision for documentation. On to the next slide, which covers notice and posting. The links are on the slide, and the standard is that employers must post and keep posted in a place accessible to the employer's employees a copy of the posters linked or notice furnished by the city, which they've furnished. This must be in English, Spanish, and any other language spoken by at least 5% of the employees. And employers also must provide to each employee at the time of hire the employer's name, address, and telephone number in writing. On to the next slide regarding record keeping. West Hollywood requires records to be kept for no less than 3 years for a pretty fulsome list of topics, but notably these topics include the formula by which the employee's wages, vacation, and leaves are calculated. On to the next slide, the second to last. Payout upon separation depends on whether the employer elects to use a single or multiple buckets for compliance with the law. Accrued unused compensated leave classified as vacation or personal necessity leave must be paid out at the employee's regular rate upon termination. However, any portion of compensated leave classified as sick leave is not required to be paid to the employee upon termination. Upon reinstatement, there is no payout for unused uncompensated leave, but as we know, reinstatement is required upon rehire within 1 year of leaving. On to my final slide regarding written policy requirements and a quick note on waiver. There's no mandatory written policy requirement, but we recommend it. Although there isn't a written requirement, the rules and regulations include some examples of potential written policies, such as setting a reasonable minimum increment to use the leave. And then finally, a quick note on waiver. The city manager could grant a waiver upon an employer's demonstrating a hardship. This demonstration would be showing that they're trying to mitigate against a potential reduction of employment or work hours, or to avoid bankruptcy or a shutdown of the business. And if seeking a waiver, the employer needs to provide advance written notice to all employees and a written notice of the city manager's determination within 3 business days. So with that, I will transition it back to Renata.
Thank you, Bernie. We will move on to Bloomington, Minnesota. So Bloomington, Minnesota is the most recently enacted paid sick leave law. And Minnesota, as it turns out, is actually a pretty active state in the paid sick leave world. Next slide, please. So as you may be aware, Minnesota has had a KinCare law in place for many years. A KinCare law does not actually require employers to provide paid sick leave, but if an employer does provide paid sick leave, what the KinCare law says is that employers have to allow employees to use a certain amount of that paid sick leave to take care of covered family members. Specifically in Minnesota, the requirement is that 160 hours a year have to be allowed to be used for caring for covered family members. So coming into the paid sick leave space, Minneapolis and St. Paul came on the scene back in 2017 with the first local paid sick leave laws in the state. Duluth joined in 2020. And there's actually been a push recently for a statewide paid sick leave. We have not seen that go into effect yet or be enacted yet, but that is something that is potentially on the horizon in Minnesota. So our newest Minnesota law is the Bloomington local paid sick leave law that was enacted just a couple of weeks ago on June 6th. It will go into effect on July 1, 2023. So this brings the total number of paid sick leave laws in Minnesota, local paid sick leave laws, that is, to 4. And that's actually the second highest number of any state in the U.S., second only to California, which has 10. Next slide, please. So overall, you'll see that the Bloomington paid sick leave law substantively is pretty similar to the law in Minneapolis. And so we'll cover the main substantive points of the law today. Initial threshold question is which employers are covered. You know, basically all private employers are covered. If you have 1 or more employees, then you are likely covered. There are some limited exceptions to this, and if you have fewer than 5 employees, the time may be able to be unpaid, but for the most part, private employers are covered. To be eligible to take the paid sick leave, an employee has to work at least 80 hours of work per year in the city of Bloomington. Accrual rate, 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, which is a pretty standard rate. Accrual begins immediately when an employee is hired. One note about the accrual in Bloomington is that it only accrues in full hour increments. The accrual is capped at 48 hours per year or 80 hours at any point in time. There is no usage cap written into the law, and employers are required to allow employees to carry over unused time at the end of the year. However, this can be capped at 80 hours carryover due to the 80-hour point in time cap on accrual. Employees are eligible to use their paid leave after 90 calendar days of employment. And in terms of front loading, it is permissible to use front loading instead of accrual. You would have to give at least 48 hours at the first 90 days and then at least 80 hours per year thereafter. But it is not clear at this point whether that will eliminate year-end carryover requirements. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. The reasons for use and covered family members under this law are fairly standard. This can be used for an employee's own illness, injury, health condition, preventive care, also to care for a family member for those same reasons. the typical safe time absences like we see, domestic abuse, sexual assault, stalking, and also closure of the employee's business or the employee's family member's school or place of care. Notably, the school and place of care closure includes not only closures for a public health emergency, but also other unexpected closures due to things like inclement weather. The covered family members are also fairly standard: child, spouse, sibling, parent, grandchild, grandparent, guardian, ward, other members of the employee's household. To clarify, a child does include a stepchild, adopted child, foster child, adult child. Same thing with parent, step-parent, also includes in-laws. Next slide, please. So in terms of the increments of use, an employer has to allow employees to use safe time and increments consistent with current payroll practices as defined by industry standards or existing policies, and the minimum increment cannot be more than 4 hours. If an employee has a need for foreseeable paid sick leave, the employer can require advance notice up to 7 days. Unforeseeable, the standard is our typical as soon as is practicable language, which we see under most of these laws. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. And then for documentation, 3 consecutive days absence is typically the standard, more than 3 consecutive days. All right, next slide, please. There is a requirement for employers to provide a notice of available balance of paid sick time on employee request. Specifically, this is the time that's available and the time that has been used. This can be provided by some kind of reasonable system, such as printing it on pay stubs or developing an online system where employees can log in. There is a notice and posting requirement under this law, so the city will be publishing a model poster for employers to use, and employers are required to put a notice of rights in the employee handbook. While there is no written policy mandate, it is important to update handbooks with that notice of rights because of that requirement in the law. So that's a very quick overview, and I will pass it back to Josh to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you, Renata, and thanks, Bernie and Marlon, for those overviews and updates. Before I continue with just the next couple of slides, if you can go 2 slides for me, I'm going to read off the CLE code for today's presentation. The code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 8199. Again, that is SS 8199. One more time, SS 8199. All right, so to wrap things up, and thank you to everyone for submitting questions. I've been able to respond to as many as we were able to. Thanks again for those. For purposes of where paid sick leave and PTO is heading, you've already heard about New Mexico, West Hollywood, and Bloomington, and when those respective mandates go into effect. But what else are we looking towards? Well, for starters, heading into 2023, after the November elections, will federal paid sick leave become a focus, some potential middle ground that the 2 parties can land on, especially given that the patchwork, as we saw at the very beginning of the presentation today, is covering almost 40% of the states with the statewide paid sick leave law. And as we've discussed, and as many of you know, those laws have many variations. So paying attention to the federal laws, there also are perhaps laws coming down the pipe maybe later this year in Illinois at the statewide level. Definitely keep an eye on Illinois, as this legislative session is not done yet, and there is a proposal for paid sick leave at the statewide level. Minnesota and Delaware came very close to passing a paid sick leave law at the statewide level earlier this year. Those sessions, we understand, are closed for the rest of the 2022 cycle, but pay attention to them as we head into 2023. And you can see some honorable mentions for Virginia, which has an industry-specific statewide paid sick leave law that could also perhaps be rolled out to all private employers, as well as potential amendments in New Jersey, California, as well as Connecticut. If you can go to the next 2 slides just to round out today, if the paid sick leave patchwork in New Mexico, West Hollywood, other laws are giving you challenges, we have plenty of resources that can help and a great team of attorneys ready to jump in and assist with whatever industry, however many states and localities you're in, the nature of your workers. We deal with all of it daily. So please do reach out if you have questions. Some of our resources, we have a great paid sick leave survey that all the speakers today work on very regularly to maintain. It's a comprehensive survey covering all state and local laws. You can reach out to paidleave@seyfarth.com for more info. We also have a paid leave mailing list that you can sign up at the link at the bottom of this slide. It'll take you less than a minute to sign up, maybe 2 minutes, but then you'll get access to all of our legal updates and blog posts on paid leave as we roll them out. Finally, as you'll go to the next slide, please, you will see we also have this webinar series, and all of the, again, parts that we've done so far are available, recordings and slide decks if you are interested in them. We also have a paid family leave law webinar series that we are up to part 6, I believe. We just did that last week. So if folks are interested, we also have that series available for you. And we have a podcast that we started a few months back. I am very lucky to be one of the co-hosts of our Take It or Leave It, Leave of Absence and Accommodations podcast. Episode 11 will be dropping later this week, and we cover a ton of leaves and accommodations topics, including paid sick leave, COVID paid leave, mobile workers, and all the related fun topics that come up in this space. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. Happy middle of 2022. We'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you so much. Be safe, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you again to all of our presenters. This does conclude today's webinar. Thanks to all of you for attending.